Imagine a column of Sherman tanks rolling across a French field in the twilight of 1944. From a distance, they look formidable. The olive-drab paint catches the fading light. The 75-millimeter guns are leveled at the German lines. The tracks churn through the mud. A German reconnaissance plane flies overhead, spots the formation, and radios back to artillery command. Coordinates are set. Fire is exchanged. But when the German shells land, something impossible happens. The tanks don't explode. They don't burn. They bounce. Some of them deflate like balloons, collapsing into piles of rubber and canvas. A 40-ton war machine is lifted by 4 men and carried into the woods. This was not a hallucination. It was the calculated work of the most secret, most peculiar unit in the entire European theater of World War II. They carried no heavy weapons. They had no armor. Their mission wasn't to fight the enemy. It was to haunt them. This is the story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, known today simply as the Ghost Army. For decades, their existence was a classified secret buried deep in the Pentagon's archives. Their battlefield was not made of steel and fire, but of perception, psychology, and illusion. While General Patton and General Eisenhower commanded armies of flesh and blood, this unit commanded an army of air and sound. They were the great illusionists of the war, a traveling road show of deception designed to save American lives by drawing enemy fire onto themselves. And for 50 years, not even their wives knew what they did. To understand the Ghost Army, you have to understand the desperation of 1944. The Allies had landed in Normandy, but the road to Berlin was a grinder. Every yard of ground was paid for in blood. The American command needed an edge. They needed to maneuver faster than the Germans could react. They needed the enemy to see strength where there was weakness, and weakness where there was strength. Enter the 23rd. This was a unit unlike any other in military history. It was composed of 100 men, but their job was to simulate a force of 30,000. They weren't drafted from the usual pools of infantrymen or mechanics. Many of these soldiers were recruited from art schools in New York and Philadelphia. They were painters, architects, set designers, and advertising executives from Madison Avenue. Before the war, they were sketching fashion models and designing storefronts. Now, they were tasked with the greatest art project in history, painting a picture of war convincing enough to fool the hardened generals of the Wehrmacht. Their toolkit consisted of 3 distinct types of magic: visual, sonic, and radio. The visual deception was the domain of the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. Their weapon was the pneumatic tank. These were inflatable rubber masterpieces, modeled perfectly after the M4 Sherman tank, the deuce-and-a-half truck, and heavy artillery pieces. Fully inflated, they looked deadly from a few hundred yards away. But up close, they were fragile balloons. A soldier could lift a tank over his head. The danger of this work cannot be overstated. These artists had to deploy their balloons hundreds of yards from the front lines, often under the cover of darkness. They had to inflate them with air compressors, camouflage them with cut branches, and create the tracks of a real armored column. If they were too perfect, the Germans would get suspicious. So they used bulldozers to churn up the earth, mimicking the heavy tread marks of a tank division. They hung laundry lines. They dug latrines. They created the visual clutter of a living, breathing army. But a visual lie is only one dimension. The Ghost Army had to sound real. This was the job of the 3132nd Signal Service Company. They were the audio engineers of the battlefield. In an era before digital recording, they utilized state-of-the-art wire recorders to capture the specific sounds of modern warfare. They recorded the distinct clatter of a tank on pavement versus a tank on dirt. They recorded the groaning of bridge-building equipment, the swearing of sergeants, the idling of engines. These sounds were then mixed onto massive reels of wire. To project this symphony of war, they mounted 500-pound speakers onto the backs of half-tracks. These weren't ordinary speakers. They were acoustic howitzers. They could project the sound of an armored column moving into position across 15 miles. The fidelity was so high that they could convince a German listening post that a tank division was idling just across the river, ready to attack. The 3132nd could turn a quiet night in the French countryside into the auditory chaos of an impending invasion, forcing the Germans to move their reserves to meet a threat that didn't exist. The third pillar of the deception was radio. The Germans were masters of signals intelligence. They listened to everything. If a phantom army suddenly appeared visually and sonically, but the radio waves were silent, the Germans would know it was a trap. So, the signal company's special operators stepped in. These men were the best radio operators the army had. They didn't just send fake messages, they mimicked the fist, the unique typing style of specific operators from real units. If the Ghost Army was pretending to be the 75th Infantry Division, the radio operators would study the transmission patterns of the 75th. They learned who typed fast, who typed heavy, who made specific errors. Then they took over the airwaves. They created entire fictional networks, broadcasting orders, supply requests, and casual chatter that painted a picture of a massive troop buildup. They overwhelmed German intelligence with data, confirming the visual and sonic lies being told on the ground. But the deception went even further. It became a method-acting performance. The soldiers of the Ghost Army would sew the patches of other units onto their uniforms. They would paint the bumper markings of the 6th Armored or the 90th Infantry onto their jeeps. Then they would drive into liberated French towns, go to the local cafes, and get drunk. They would spill secrets to the locals, knowing that spies were listening. They would complain about the cold, talk about their orders to move out at dawn, and brag about the massive reinforcements arriving behind them. It was a deadly theater. If they were caught, they had no heavy weapons to defend themselves. They were sitting ducks inside rubber tanks. The unit arrived in Europe shortly after D-Day, and immediately went to work. They took part in over 20 operations, moving constantly, sleeping in the mud, always one step ahead of the enemy. One of their most critical tests came in September 1944, during the siege of Brest. The Americans needed to take the port city, but the German defenses were brutal. The Ghost Army was deployed to the flanks to simulate a massive buildup, drawing German artillery fire away from the real attack zones. It worked. The Germans wasted thousands of rounds pulverizing empty fields and rubber tanks, while the real American forces broke through elsewhere. However, the war was not just a series of victories. In December 1944, the Germans launched their last, desperate counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge. The Allied lines were shattered. Confusion reigned. In the freezing cold of the Ardennes, the Ghost Army found themselves in a terrifying position. They were asked to plug a hole in the line. For days, this small unit of artists and sound engineers held a defensive perimeter against the advance of the Third Reich. They used their sonic trucks not to deceive, but to simulate the sound of approaching American reinforcements to boost the morale of the battered troops around them. It was a moment where the illusion had to hold not just for the enemy, but for their own side. But their masterpiece, the operation that cemented their legacy, came near the very end of the war. It was March 1945. Operation Viersen. The Allies needed to cross the Rhine River, the final natural barrier into the heart of Germany. The crossing was planned at the town of Wesel. To succeed, the Ninth Army needed the Germans to believe the main attack was happening somewhere else. 10 miles south, at a place called Viersen, the Ghost Army set the stage for their grand finale. They had to impersonate 2 full divisions, the 30th and the 79th. That meant simulating over 30,000 men and thousands of vehicles. The 1,100 men of the Ghost Army worked around the clock. They inflated hundreds of dummy tanks and trucks. They set up fake artillery batteries. They drove their real trucks in loops, creating the traffic jams of a massive staging area. The sonic trucks blasted the sounds of pontoon bridges being built and tanks warming up their engines. The radio networks buzzed with the frantic coordination of a river crossing. From the German side of the river, the picture was clear. The Americans were gathering at Viersen. The German command fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. They shifted their artillery and reserve panzer units south to meet the phantom threat. They prepared to slaughter a crossing force that wasn't there. On the night of March 23rd, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine at Wesel with minimal resistance. The German guns that should have been firing on them were miles away, aiming at rubber balloons. The Ghost Army watched from a distance as the sky lit up with the deception that likely saved thousands of American lives in a single night. As the real troops advanced into Germany, the artists of the 23rd packed up their inflatables, deflated their tanks, and disappeared into the rear. When the war ended, there were no parades for the Ghost Army. There were no headlines detailing their exploits. Their mission was considered too valuable to reveal. The Cold War was beginning, and the U.S. Army believed that the tactics of sonic and visual deception might be needed against the Soviets. The soldiers were ordered to keep their mouths shut. They went home to their wives and families and told them they had been in the engineers or the signal corps. They resumed their lives as artists, fashion designers, and architects. Bill Blass, who would become a world-famous fashion designer, served in the unit. Ellsworth Kelly, a giant of modern art, was there too. They took the secrets of the Ghost Army into their studios, their wartime sketches hidden in attics. For 50 years, the story of the Ghost Army was a rumor, a whisper among veterans. It wasn't until 1996 that the documents were finally declassified. The world finally learned that a small group of artists had fooled Hitler's army. In 2022, nearly 80 years after they landed in France, the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. By then, most of them were gone, but their legacy remains one of the most remarkable anomalies of warfare. In a conflict defined by industrial slaughter and atomic power, they proved that imagination could be as lethal as gunpowder. They proved that the art of war is not always about who has the biggest gun, but who tells the better story. They were the soldiers who fired no bullets, yet won battles. They were the tanks that could float on air. They were the voices in the night that terrified the enemy. They were the ghost army, and for the briefest moment in history, they made the impossible real. When we look back at the liberation of Europe, we see the iron and the steel, but we must also remember the rubber and the wire, and the men who stood unarmed on the front lines, shielded only by a lie.